Okay, Bud, first, thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed for this. We hope that these go to the Library of Congress and provide a history for a number of years for the people who lived in World War II. And as with all of the veterans of World War II, we've started these interviews by asking what you remember about December 7, 1941, because we think that's really the defining event of World War II.
Okay, I remember it well. My father was a contractor, and we lived in Grove City, Pennsylvania, and he had a contract in Sandy Lake, Pennsylvania, which was about 20 miles north of Grove City. And this was a medical doctor in Sandy Lake, and he and his wife were in Florida, and they wanted their house ready for Christmas. So I was in Grove City College, and my dad thoroughly enjoyed my older brother and I working with him, and on weekends, simply because he didn't have to pay overtime to his employees. So my dad and I were going up to Sandy Lake on a Sunday morning to help get this job finished. And we turned on the radio, and gee, we heard all this stuff about Pearl Harbor. We didn't even really honestly know where Pearl Harbor actually was. My dad and I kept thinking it must be in the Philippines. But well, I remember it well. I even remember it was an overcast day, but not a snowy day. Well, I had an aunt that was a school teacher in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, and it was quite customary for her to come up on Sunday afternoon and have Sunday evening dinner with us in Grove City, which she was coming this Sunday night. Well, when we got home, of course, that's all we were talking about was Pearl Harbor, and we kept saying that it was in the Philippines. Well, my aunt, being a geography teacher in school, she said, no, it's in the Philippines. Well, to be honest with you, we went upstairs to a bedroom and got an atlas out and found out that Pearl Harbor was in Honolulu.
It was in Hawaii.
Yeah, big part, yes, yeah. That was it. But I remember it well.
Oh.
And we, of course, didn't have the slightest understanding of what was going to happen after that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. Well, how did your family and others react to it? Did you have any? Do you remember anything specifically?
Well, my one memory of how everybody reacted to it was, well, I'll say 200% support of United States, and we had absolutely, the thing that's hard for people to understand today, we had no military preparedness at that time. Mm-hmm. If the Japs had come on our west coast, the only thing the farmers would have had was shotguns. Hmm. And that's where they probably made the mistake.
Yeah. Well, let's back up a little bit. How about telling us briefly about your life before Pearl Harbor? What were you?
Okay. I graduated from college in 1938. So I was, I'll say I think I was probably a sophomore in college in 1941. I had, at the end of my sophomore year, second semester of my sophomore year, I had my tonsils and appendix out, so I missed a semester of college. And so there was no question, I was a depression kid, but with the World War II coming on, our economy was starting to build because our factories were starting to get ready. Now, there was another good thing about World War II. Although there was a lot of unemployment, they kept the factories maintained, ready to go if work did come. So our factories were ready to go the minute they needed, had contracts. Mm-hmm. So it's just amazing how, in a year's time, how we got prepared for World War II.
Okay. Well, when did you enter the service, and were you drafted, or did you enlist?
Well, as I recall, and I think I'm right, the draft age was 21 at first. And I remember Grove City College had Cubs airplanes where you could go out and sign up and fly, get 10 hours of flight in Cub airplanes. But I wasn't 21. You had to be 21 to be able to sign for yourself. And my dad would not sign. He was World War I, and he wouldn't sign anything. He said when I was 21, if I wanted to do it, I could go. So I couldn't take any of that flight training. But then at 21, I had to, that was 1942, I had to, February 1st, I had to sign up for the draft. Well, my wife and I got married May 1st of 1942. And we're going to a church school. We were both had dropped out of school. We knew we'd get kicked out if we didn't. So we both dropped out that semester. And Marg, my wife, took her parents to El Paso to visit her older brother that lived there. And so then when she came back home, that's when we made our plans for May 1st wedding. And then had our own apartment in Grove City. I was allowed to go back to school after one semester, but Presbyterian rules wouldn't allow her to go back at all. So at any rate, I got a job working in Cooper Industries, fortunately from 3 in the afternoon to 11 at night, that allowed me to enroll in Grove City College and finish my last semester of school. And oh no, I guess that wouldn't be my last semester. Well, that would be next to the last semester. That would be the fall term. And I was also coaching, assistant coach in the football team in that year too. And as soon as football was done, that's when I went to work for the college. Or went to work for Cooper Industries. Okay.
Well, so when did you really enter the service?
I enlisted in Pittsburgh.
In Pittsburgh?
And then when the second semester of college had started, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, when they opened Miami Beach as a training center, and they just called hundreds of college students into. We were the first ones to go to Pittsburgh, or to go to Miami Beach and open it up, and help clean up all the restaurants and get them ready. And I'll say that took our first 2 weeks of military training. We might have learned to march and drill a little bit, but most of it was cleaning up dining halls and getting them ready for the troops.
But you were just a private, right? You did.
Oh yeah, we were. Let's see. I was married, and so remember, up until about that time, married people were not allowed to enlist in cadets. But that was suspended, and I was allowed to enlist. And so I got into the cadets, and I guess, yes, we were, at that time, we were just privates until we went to Santa Ana into the cadet program, right. And now I don't think I told you the other night, I had, after we left Miami Beach, we went to Oshkosh, Wisconsin to a college training detachment. And I didn't mention that. Well, we did, and we were the first ones to go into, they opened up colleges for this kind of training ahead of the cadets, till the cadets got, had room for us. And so we went to Oshkosh. We were the first troops to open Oshkosh, just like Miami Beach. And we arrived in Oshkosh, left Miami Beach when it was warm, and we had been swimming in the beach, and I think that was probably March. Probably March. And we went, the first thing we knew, we were getting into colder climate. Then we hit Chicago. We knew where we were, but we didn't know where we were going. And we arrived about midnight in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And they got us off the train, and we marched right down through the heart of Oshkosh, and of course all the people were out waiting for us. And I'll say one thing, Oshkosh was a very receptive town. They did everything nice for the military there. Even on Saturday nights they'd have household parties and invite us. I've never seen a little town that opened its arms to incoming troops.
Can you sit up a little bit?
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, so when did you start into the flying business?
When did we start flying?
Yeah.
Well, okay, now we had a couple good courses that I learned a lot in electricity at Oshkosh. I thought Oshkosh did an excellent job of training. We weren't there very long. I doubt if we were there a month. But whatever time we had, oh yeah, and also they took us out to the Oshkosh airport and and let us. We didn't solo or anything, but we did fly some Cubs while we were there. Okay, so it was. We really didn't weren't there long. I'll say at the most 6 weeks. And I know my wife came up to visit a weekend, and I think the next Monday after she was there, we took off. We didn't know where, but ended up in Santa Ana, California, and that's when we went into the Aviation Cadets Pre-Flight School.
Okay.
At Santa Ana, and then I don't remember what was it, a 6 weeks program there, mostly physical education, getting your uniforms and shots. We got all the shots at Santa Ana and that sort of thing. And then after I'll say 6 weeks at Santa Ana, I remember we had a lot of physical education and we had a lot of rope climbing and that sort of thing. And then we were transferred to Ontario to Calero Academy for primary training.
Is that what's Calero Academy?
What's this?
What is Calero Academy?
Oh, Calero, California Aero, AERO Academy.
Okay.
It was a private flying school that was contracting with the Air Force, and they had been in. It was an old school. They had been training cadets for a number of years, and they had been training cadets, and I'll say, of course, there were military people there, and military pilots would give us check rides, but our instructors basically were civilians.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to remember my instructor's name, but I can't think. It'll probably come to me again.
Okay.
His first name was George, but I can't think of his last name.
Do you remember your first solo flight?
Yes, I do, in a Stearman. Yeah, and I had absolutely no problem. I'll say in flying, I did better by myself than I did dual. Dual instruction always made me nervous for some reason or other. I don't know why, but if I could get out solo, I was ready to go. And that's, I remember I had absolutely no problem soloing.
Mm-hmm. So do you remember how many hours you got in this German, approximately?
I'm going to say at the most 50, because Calero was changed from a primary school to a basic school while we were there. And I'll say we got about half of our primary hours in the Stearman, and then they put us in to complete primary in a basic trainer. And for some reason or other, that basic trainer, well, it had a wide landing gear, it was in flaps, and I guess radios and things like that. It was a very easy plane to fly, a Vultee. And we called it a Vultee vibrator, as I recall. I think they were BT-15s and BT-17s,
okay,
as I recall.
Well, what did you do? After you got out of pilot training, where'd you go? I mean, after your primary?
After we got out of primary, and I will say, our basic training, we were already checked out. We had a lot of solo, a lot of cross country, which I think was very fortunate. Now, one thing I do remember on the California coast, I'll say it was probably early March, we got fogged in. No, it wasn't. It had to. My dates are maybe a little wrong, because it had to be in December. They took us up to the Mojave Desert I think they call it Victor Field, to get our flying time in from the fog. And I can remember we soloed a plane and we followed the instructor up through Santa Ana and up Santa Barbara and up a valley. I can remember that. And we just followed the instructor, and he landed and we landed right behind him. And as I recall, we had radios at that little field. And we slept in tents. And I always sort of had a problem sleeping in a tent. As a kid, I had asthma. And when we went camping as a family, I always slept in the car. That was the first time I had slept in a tent, and I didn't know what to expect since I was a kid. But I had no problem. I had no problem with it. Slept good.
Okay. After that, didn't you go to Marfa?
Yes, after we left basic, we went to Marfa, Texas for advanced, and it was twin engine advanced. And I'll admit, of course, they were outdated by the time I got there. I was always a reader about the CBI and about the Chenault's Flying Tigers. And but I was never really, I never had a desire to fly a fighter, but I always had a desire to be a B-25 pilot. And I managed to get in a B-25 pilot when I was up in Great Falls. Thought I was going to get checked out, but I never did. But I always was enthralled by the B-25 for something. I guess it was probably Doolittle's raid had something to do with that. That came about that time.
What did you fly at Marfa?
They were AT-17s, advanced trainer, twin engines, I guess it was Beechcraft, or they were twin engine, fiber sides and fiber wings, and well, I always liked the little plane. You could all, when we'd go solo, there'd be pilot, co-pilot, and maybe two others in the back end, and that sort of thing.
Well, where'd you go from Marfa?
Okay, from Marfa, after graduation for class 44D, I was sent to instructor school down at San Antonio at Randolph Field. It was an instructor school. However, when we got in there, they were closing that field as an instructor. I think maybe I had one or two flights down there and transferred back to Marfa for a reassignment someplace, either as an instructor there or someplace else. So I was probably there, no more than 2 or 3 weeks, and then I was transferred to Reno, Nevada for C-46 training.
What did you think about going to the C-46?
Well, it was a large airplane, little or nothing about it. When C-46 had, I guess when I went to Reno, I didn't even know what a C-46 was. And that's where I saw the first one, I'm certain. And as I recall, they did take us up, a whole group of us, up in a C-46 when we first got there, just to see how large it was. Well, compared to, I'll say, B-17s, B-24s, which had landed at Marfa, 46 was a pretty big plane, and that pilot's seat was up in the air. I'll say 20 or 25 feet. You were way up off of the nose. It was had a tail dragger, but the nose set way up high.
Did you ever fly the Gooney Bird to C-47?
Yes. Now, when we got to Reno, they didn't have room for us, so we were all transferred elsewhere, and I was transferred up to Great Falls, Montana, which the ATC Ferry Command. They were basically, well, they ferried a lot of planes, but number one, they were ferrying B-17s out of Seattle, Washington. And most of it was down to Oklahoma, where the guns were put on the B-17s and they were modified, ready for combat. And occasionally when we'd land in Oklahoma, then we'd have to take a B-17 to wherever the base was for our crew was going to pick it up to go overseas. But
well, were you checked out in B-17?
No, I was never. Well, however, somehow if you had a twin engine rating out of cadets at that time, you were classified a Class 5 pilot, which meant you could fly if they wanted. You could fly a B-17 if you wanted to, or you could fly a C-47 if you wanted to, because that was the rating they gave you at that time in the ATC. There was there was a scarcity of pilots, and if there was a job to be done, you got it. And that's the same way flying the C-47. Now, it sticks in my mind, I had something checked. I knew something about a C-47 before we took the one up to Alaska. I'm trying to think. Well, I can remember up there at Great Falls on a weekend, if you didn't have anything to do, you want to take an AT-6 out, They just go to operations and they tell you there's an AT-6, go ahead and take it. And my first time flying over Yellowstone was out of Great Falls in an AT-6 on a Sunday afternoon. Now let me tell you something. I knew where the gear up lever was, and I pulled that gear up lever, but I didn't know that hydraulic system, you had to shove a pump or something in the handle there, that long handle, to get that gear to come up. So I flew down over the Yellowstone with my gear down. Now I knew it was down, and I knew it hadn't come up. So when I come back to land at Great Falls, I asked the tower to check my gear down. It never did come up, so it was down and latch. And that's how I really learned how on the. The AT-6 had the same hydraulic system as a C-47. You put it whatever position you want it, and then you shove that hydraulic handle. And I learned a lot on that AT-6. When I found out my gear wasn't down, I didn't know what to think, but I did get back to Great Falls from Yellowstone.
Were you solo?
Was what?
Were you
I was
solo?
solo all by myself, yeah. If you were a Class 5 pilot, you could fly anything in those days. Yeah.
The C-46s you flew, most of them were brand new aircraft, were they not?
Oh yeah, no, the training planes, had been used a good bit, but the C-46 was brand new, yeah. Yeah, and we had excellent ground school on the engines and all the systems. When they first came out, they had some kind of problem with the hydraulics. But even in all the flying I did in the 46, I never had any hydraulic problem. And but they evidently, the first ones that went over the hump, they did have a lot of problems. But when I was flying them, we never had any problems.
Well, after you finished your training, I guess you went overseas. Tell us about your trip over.
Okay, well, we came back to Reno and I finished the school there, and then we got to go to a leave, I think 10-day leave at home. And then from home, we crewed up in Memphis, Tennessee, where we picked up our C-46. There were two crews on a plane, and we did take some turns, but there was one pilot, and he happened to be a captain, that he was in charge of all of us. The crew that I was with as a co-pilot, the pilot was a first lieutenant. They had all been flying, a lot of ferry flights in the United States. So we flew over, we picked the plane up, and went out to one of the islands out off of, we picked the plane up in Memphis, flew to Miami. And at Miami we picked up a ATC navigator, overseas navigator. We didn't have, C-46 crews didn't have navigators assigned to them. We did have an engineer, a radio operator. But we picked up an engineer and a overseas navigator at Miami Beach. And then we flew out to one of the islands, I can't remember which, stayed there overnight. And then from there we flew down to the east coast of South America. And as I recall, we landed twice in South America. The first night we landed, and then the next day I can remember it took us an hour to go over the mouth of the Amazon River. We all timed it. And then we landed someplace south of the Amazon. And then we took off from there to Ascension Island. Okay. And Ascension Island to the west coast of Africa. Well, there was quite a number of planes in the group that we were going. However, when we landed in North Africa, then we were being assigned to Casablanca. We turned and went north up the Atlantic coast. And it was quite ticklish because some of those countries were independent. We couldn't fly over them. I remember that. We landed at, I think our air base was called Rabat, R-A-B-O-T, out of Casablanca. Mm-hmm. And then I was stationed in Casablanca. I'll say that was probably October, and from October till after Christmas, I was for about 3 months in North Africa.
I need to back up just a second. As you went from the east coast of South America over the water, did you fly in formation? Was there a group of airplanes, or were you solo, by yourself?
No, we were independent. There would be maybe a plane 10 or 15 minutes in front of us. And I do remember going over that, what used to be an A20, and I think they called it a B26 or something, had put these new engines, and I think the number were R2800. Did you ever hear that?
Absolutely.
Okay, well I think that's the engines we had in the 46, and the engines on the B29, and this A20 had it. Oh, this A20 was so damn fast, or whatever it was, B26, I think they gave it that new number, or A26. That thing came up beside us, feathered an engine, and then just passed us on one engine. And those were good engines. They were darn good engines. I'll never forget that because we all saw that. And he had taken off behind us, but he caught us in no time at all.
So you go into a robot, and I understand you had a little excitement there one day.
Rabat?
Didn't you lose an engineer or something?
Oh yeah, that was on a trip coming back from Cairo one time. Yeah, we had, that's my first experience with single engines. It was early in the morning with a lot of cumulus clouds, and it was cold. It was, okay, according to...
Just keep going.
Okay.
No, just...
I'll keep going. According to the military, Africa wasn't rated as entitled winter clothing or winter routine and blankets and stuff like that. And so we weren't provided any blankets in our BOQ. So most of us went out and bought sheepskin robes, and so it was cold as heck in North Africa. It wasn't warm in North Africa. Yeah, we did have a single engine, and that's where I got experience in keeping a C-46 engine. Go learn to put that heat on when you thought there was any chance of carburetor icing, and get that heat on. Well, we did. We lost the engine, and we feathered it, and I threw the carburetor heat on and squirted some alcohol in it. And as we were on our downwind approach, we got the engine started again. So we actually made the landing on 2 engines. Mm-hmm. But that's, as far as I say, I talk about having good training. There was one experience. The other thing out of Great Falls, ferrying C-47 to Alaska, we had a single engine. And so I had a little darn good experience before I got over to the CPI.
We crossed over that Alaska trip. Tell us about that Alaska incident.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we got into the soup and icing conditions, and we had an engine ice up, and we were getting ice on our wings and everything else. And this was a plane for the Russians, and he had explained the valves to us, but you know, they just pointed to them. But I had to go back in the back end and get this the alcohol turned on, which I did. And as I was coming back up to the front seat, the pilot was in a screaming dive, and I just grabbed the elevator controls and trimmed it back and got in and got that airplane straightened up. And lo and behold, I looked down and there was a lake, and it was ISHEC. Well, we knew there was a Canadian field at ISHEC. So we got our manuals out and got the radar and called for landing instructions, so they allowed us to land there. And one of the things I remember, I was seeing the Indians drying these great big fish. Well, I'd have given anything to go out fishing. The Indians told us they'd take us out the next morning, but lo and behold, when we got up the next morning, the sun was shining nice and bright, so we got ready to take off. But the first time we started to take off, there must have been 10 ponies out on the far end of the runway. So those Canadians got in their Jeep and chased the ponies away, and we took off, and we were only about an hour's time out of Fairbanks, as I recall.
No, that's interesting. Okay, let's go back to your overseas time. When did you arrive in India, and where did you fly out of?
Okay, when I came back from a Christmas flight, we had orders. This was the end of December. We had orders to be transferred to India. There were about 12 of us, 10 or 12 of us, flying out of North Africa, out of Rabat. So we were all due right after Christmas, and we got a flight out of Casablanca or Rabat to Cairo, and then across the Middle East. We landed someplace, I don't remember, in the Middle East. And then we landed on the west coast of India. I'm trying to think of the name of the town. I should remember it, but I can't right now. I know it was west of Agra. Agra was the Taj Mahal, but can't think of the name of the. Well, that was the receiving, the CBI receiving and processing, where we'd stay there until a base needed somebody. Well, if you remember, January, they had a lot of wind problems and they lost a lot of pilots over the hump about the first week of January.
Just January of 45.
45, January 45, the winds had a 90-degree shift to the south, which was unheard of, and drove a lot of planes up north coming back from China to the Brahmaputra Valley. They referred to it as the worst night ever, and they just lost a lot of planes. So I think we were replacements for those pilots. I know the bed I took over was one of the pilots that was lost that night.
Okay, tell us about the flying the hump. What was your mission? What were you carrying?
Okay.
The length of the flights and the altitude. Just tell us about that mission.
There's no question. Now, there was a gasoline refinery close to our base. I was based at Chabua in Upper Assam.
How do you spell that?
Chabua.
Okay.
And it was a tea plantation that was taken over and an air base made out of it. This Upper Assam was all British tea plantation farms, or I guess whatever they'd call them. But they grew tea and they shaded it with walnut trees. So I'll admit we had a barrel of walnuts sitting at our dining room all the time because they couldn't ship them out during the war. But there was, there was Chabua. Chabua was a headquarters base. Lido, Moenbury, Sukrating were several of the names of the fields up. There were about 10 fields up in the Brahmaputra Valley. Some were B-24s converted to haul oil and gasoline. And our number one cargo was 55-gallon drums of 100-octane gasoline for the bombers and the fighter planes under Chenault in China. We'd have a period of time where we'd haul gasoline. Then the next load would be 500-pound bombs, or maybe some ammunition for the guns aboard the planes or the guns on the fighter planes. And then the first thing, we'd go over there sometime and we couldn't land till they got the mission off, and that sort of thing. So that's about the way it went. Now we did have to haul some passengers, but not too many. The passenger flying came after World War II ended in Europe, and we flew an awful lot of troops over to China after the World War II ended in Europe. That was the summer of 45. Yes. And
so how high were the mountains, and what altitudes did you fly, and what was the biggest hazard that you encountered?
Okay, now remember, China National was still flying C-47s. So they had, I'll say, from 15,000 to 20,000. We never got to fly below 20,000. And so we were always above 20, probably most of it between 20 and 30,000. Now I have had a C-46 empty coming back. We stayed above an overcast. I know they'll get up to 36,000. That doesn't sound like much today, but in those days that was pretty high. And that was sort of the way it went. Now we remember, electricity was very scarce over there. Our planes, any maintenance was done in the daylight. So most of we got called for flight after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We always had to be available after 4 o'clock for being called for flight. So most of our flying was at night. And I'll say that's another good thing, because the Japs did not fly at night. So we were glad to fly at night. And most of our flying was night flying, and most of it was instrument. I'll say better than 50%. Especially in the wintertime, when you take off, you got your gear up, you were in the soup. So and we always had we had to climb to 10,000 feet over Moran, a fighter base, before we'd head out over the Naga Hills. And we had to have 10,000 feet. That's where we'd put our oxygen masks on and get ready for altitudes. And put the superchargers in too. We'd had to put the blowers in over Moran, or other bases had another fighter place that they'd probably climb over. And then we'd head out. The Naga Hills went up to about 10,000 feet. And maybe a few might have gone up to 12. But we had to have 10,000 feet before we went over the valley. See, we went over to over the Naga Hills into that North Burma Valley. Mekong River or something comes down through there and forms with into somebody else and made the Irrawaddy that went down through Burma. And now fortunately, when I checked out and was over there, we were flying what we called the Southern Route. That's after the Japs were run out of Mishinlaw or northern Burma. So we could fly the Southern Route, which the mountains were a little bit lower. And but we always were at least above 20,000 feet.
What was the altitude of the mountains? How high were those mountains you're flying over?
Well, I'm going to say we had some that were 18 and 20. Now, they probably were not on our route, or they would be to the side of you. But like the night that all the wind shifted 90 degrees without anybody knowing it, a lot of planes got blown up in that area. And the only way they ever got out of it was just luck, because they didn't know they were up in there. This was a change that occurred, I'll say, within an hour. You know, the weathermen were studying the winds aloft and everything, but they had no indication this hit. They never really knew what caused it to swing 90 degrees, but it did. And I'll say I always felt real good at 25,000. And that's probably between 23, 24, 26,000 was our normal altitude. And the big problem, of course, was icing conditions. And here again, you knew there was an overcast, but you didn't know that there was a thundercloud in there that was putting the ice on. And that ice would just slap you, without you knowing it, and you were covered. And we did have alcohol. We had electric heat on our propellers. So we just, whatever you had to do to try to get rid of it. Boy, if you saw where the propellers, they had counter-rotating that's another thing nice on the C-46. But boy, when that ice came off, boy, that just sounded like a machine gun hitting right there by your seat. And all our planes were banged up around that, so from throwing ice on it.
Did you have boots, or did you have heat in your wings? How did you keep it?
Well, we had those electric, what they call, or we had gas heaters in them. And when they were new, they'd work, and they didn't maintain them. When they quit, they were out. So they would sometimes work up to 10 or 15,000, but when you get up higher than that, they'd cut off. What do they call those heaters? Ventral or something, I forget what the name was. But they just sat back there like a tube, and they had, I guess, gas heat in there, gas flames. And if they were new, they worked good. But you get them above 25,000, they'd usually cut out on you.
Okay, when you got to China, what'd you do? Have an instrument let down most of the time?
Yeah, the first base, normally where we always would check in at Kunming, and I'll say probably, I used to think that better than half my flights were into Kunming. But I checked my logbook one time, and that's about right. 50% of my flights were Kunming, but they'd get us...
What's that word, Chongming?
Kunming.
Kunming.
K-U-N-M-I-N-G. And I think it's got a new name, since the communists took it over. Well, maybe not. I think Kunming is still called Kunming. Some of the other, but there were also side bases. Luliang was a B-29 base with a big long runway. And I had quite a few flights into Luliang. If we came when the B-29s were taking off on a mission, we just have to circle. And then Chanyi was a base that I had a lot of fly. It was sort of about 100 miles northeast of Kunming.
Okay.
I had a lot of flights in there. And then there was another one, Yunnan-Yi or something. But they were fighter bases out there, you know, and they needed gasoline. I can remember that Chanyi was a very dangerous. It didn't matter where the winds, you always landed one way. And the way you landed, there was a great big canyon on the end of the runway. And normally you had a headwind. But I remember one night coming in perfectly normal, doing everything that you expected, but that damn plane wouldn't go down. and I don't know, I guess I had a tailwind or something. But boy, I got that baby down, and I was glad to get turned around at the end of that runway. Because we had quite a few pilots that did go over that runway.
What percentage of your pilots that were flying that had to bail out or had problems?
Okay, somehow the number 50% is in my mind, but that isn't right. I've checked the statistics. I'll say we probably at our base lost 25% of our pilots. I'd say that's a pretty. No, I say lost. They bailed out, whether they were lost. We had an excellent search and rescue. If a pilot bailed out and he had any contact, that search and rescue generally get them picked up or drop them instructions, a radio and food and stuff, and direct them as to how to get out and to where they could pick them up on that Lido Stillwell Road coming down through North Burma. As soon as that road got pretty well along and got the Japs out of there, our pilots, most of them, if they bailed out, they got. Okay, I told you a story, I think, about hauling gasoline to a fighter base, and we couldn't ever understand why the Japanese left that fighter base, why they didn't take it. And then all of a sudden they found out there was a warlord there that was feeding the Japs information. Well, this commander of the fighter base wanted to get the hell out of there because he was doing more damage than he was good. And we had to fly him in gasoline. Oh, it was a vicious night. I was number 2 plane. And I found out why we had 3 planes. Icing conditions. The first pilot, I don't know how far he got till he bailed out. The second pilot was coming into mission on a single engine, but then they decided to bail out. They evidently couldn't, I don't know what wrong, but they bailed. I was the only plane that got through. Well, I found out why they had 3 planes. They only needed 1 because we had plenty of gas to get all those fighters out.
Is that correct?
And they got out real fast back to Kunming.
Okay, you were really flying for essentially 6 or 7 months. You were flying 6 or 7 months, and you flew how many missions over there?
I got my 104 missions well, I'll say I had my 104. But I don't think I needed it. They gave me some credit for my flying in North Africa. Not much. I'll say maybe 10 hours or something like that. But I got some credit for flying in North Africa. And I know the war was over. The war was over before I had all my missions in. We were checking combat cargo pilots out on the hump routes. And that's probably one of my last flights over the hump, was checking combat cargo pilots out. They just fly a route check with us, and just to get see the bases and see the landing and that sort. They had been flying down in Burma, dropping supplies to the army and stuff down through there.
Well, evidently you stayed there until the end of the war. I guess the first thing. How did you hear about Nagasaki and Hiroshima?
Well, we didn't know anything about it, but I know I was sitting out there in a pair of shorts when some fella came running from the dining hall, and they had heard that we dropped an atomic bomb on Japan. Now, we all had briefings on the fact that, there were 500,000 Japanese in occupied China. You know, they had gone in there early in the war, and they were really taking the food from the Chinese people. Well, then after World War II ended in Europe, we started getting troops in there. We knew that's when we started having good information, and we knew that we were driving the Japs back. And as we'd retake one of our bases that the Japs had captured, then, you know, we'd move troops in there and we'd start hauling supplies into that. So we knew the Japs were under real pressure. We also knew when we drove them out of North Burma that, well, there were lots of them left there. How they were living, I don't know. Well, they steal from the natives or, you know, take anything they could eat. But there were still lots of Japs around in little groups. And we got them captured or something. But we started getting pretty good intelligence information. But we knew nothing about the atomic bombs. And that's the first. But we did know, see, the B-24s and the B-29s, the B-24s were the ones that bombed the shipping mostly. They did do some bombing in China, but the B-29s, and then they moved the B-29s to the islands. And we knew that the Japs were defeated. It was just a matter of them surrendering. And, let's see, I remember the atomic bomb, and I know I was scheduled to fly a C-47 down to Calcutta when I got orders to come home. And I called the scheduling officer, and no problem, there were lots of pilots that had their time in. So, let's see, there was a fellow by the name of Frank Varner who had flown a lot of co-pilot. He had cracked up a plane flying over, wearing it over. He was made permanent co-pilot. He and I were pretty good friends, and we played, you know, we had always had chess games and stuff in the bashes and that sort of thing. So he and I came home together, and it seems to me there was another fellow from California. His name will come to me. There were the three of us that sort of crewed us up as we headed out. And then when we got to where we got this C-54 was on the west coast of India, where the base where we came in at when we were first assigned. And I know it's communist territory now. One of the territories that we've had a little problem with over there.
So you guys just flew a C-54 home as a private transportation?
Three crews of us. And it was picked up in West India. Bill Stingley, a pilot who had lived with us in our base, he and a couple other guys got this C-54, and we were notified to wait and that we were going to go with them. So we brought the C-54 home, had a great trip. We could do about anything we wanted to along the way.
Okay, so, we need to kind of wrap this up, but when you got home, did you separate pretty quickly, or what'd you do?
When we landed at Miami Beach, we landed at one of the islands and spent a couple days swimming. I remember the runway came right down along the sandy beach. I don't know what island it was, but we spent 2 days there. It was real nice. A lot of military spent some time on that beach. Then we landed at Miami Beach and turned the plane in, and then we got orders to come home.
So did you separate from the service then?
Well, not quite. I had to report to Pittsburgh ATC base up at the Pittsburgh airport, and they talked to you whether you wanted to stay in or wanted to get out. And I just said I wanted to get out, so they gave me orders to go to Newark, New Jersey, to a separation base there. And I think that was shortly before Christmas, 45. Yeah.
Well, that was pretty quick. That was pretty quick turnaround from being, being in combat.
Well, then, of course, we had all that leave time before you actually, you got your pay and everything mailed to you until your actual terminal leave time was up and that sort of thing.
Okay. So, did you stay in the reserves, or
In reserves after World War II.
what was the effect of that?
Well,
were you recalled, or?
When I was in Pennsylvania, see, I went to University of Pittsburgh Graduate School, and I taught high school out of Pittsburgh at Mars, Pennsylvania. I don't think I ever did anything with the reserves for about 3 years. I didn't do anything with the reserves till we came back to El Paso. My wife and I went out there on just on vacation to visit her brother one summer, and well, I had several people that offered me jobs. Well, really, I was thinking of going back and teaching high school. See, I did my practice teaching in El Paso after World War II, and I was going to go back and I think I had a job offer from El Paso schools. Well, when I got into El Paso, my brother-in-law wanted me to go to work for El Paso Natural Gas Company, and he had it all fixed up. Well, I went down and talked to El Paso Natural Gas Company, and then I went back and talked to the school. Now, El Paso has a funny system. If you're going to coach, they won't tell you what you're going to coach until you start the school, sign your contract. So I didn't want to. Well, I had coached basketball, and the only thing I had coached basketball at Mars, but I wasn't a coach. I wanted to coach football or wrestling. Well, they wouldn't tell me at the El Paso School District headquarters which one I was going to coach. I'm sure I'd have probably gotten football and wrestling but they wouldn't tell me, so I had a pretty darn good job offer from El Paso Natural Gas Company, so I took it. And then, along with working at El Paso Natural Gas Company, mostly through churches, we had a lot of friends from, well, it was Texas School of Mines in those days. Okay, the dean Ray Small was a good friend of ours through church work. Well, the first thing he wanted me to go up to UTEP and start teaching right away. Well, I didn't have enough graduate work at that time yet, and so at least I started teaching night school up there, and I don't know, taught quite a few nights until I started traveling and so much for the gas company. But I thoroughly enjoyed teaching night school at UTEP. I got, with the products company and sold the Shell Oil Company, and they wanted to transfer me to Tulsa, and that's when I went back to full-time college teaching.
We need to kind of wrap it up. And looking back at your military, what do you think how did the military service affect the rest of your life?
Well, I think it showed me that my previous education was damn important. I was very glad I had calculus and trigonometry. Our decision making in flying an airplane over the hump had to be fast, and you had to calculate headings in your head, and headings and times, and you sure better be right. And I'll say it taught me the value of what an education was. I've never regretted, I started out as an engineer, and I had physics through electricity, and we didn't even have much in the way of radio in those ways. However, Grove City College, Harmon, the physics professor, had a radio station of his own, early, before KDKA did. So I'll say it made me respect education and the worth of a good education. And my previous training at Cooper Bessemer was all important in the military. And as I look back, the military subjects we had were important after we got out of school. You take navigation and all that stuff, it's just an interesting stuff to know. And good conversation pieces too, and that sort of thing. So I felt the good education it's what got me through the hump flying.
But you did use the GI Bill after you got out.
Oh yeah, GI Bill, you bet. I got all my graduate credits under the GI Bill. And between the two schools, now I'll admit, I had about 9 hours I had to finish when I left Pittsburgh to go to El Paso. But I got approval from Pitt to take the courses at UTEP. And then I didn't know, well, I don't think it would have made any difference. I did have to take tests when I come back to Pittsburgh and take tests to get my graduate credit. And that, well, that just delayed me a year from getting the degree. But I had no objection, well, to be honest with you, we don't have any complaint about life. Life's been good to us. If you start out in the depression and end up where we've ended up, what more do you want?
Absolutely.
We're not rich, but we're not poor.
That's right.
That's the way, and my wife feels the same way. We're in better health than our parents were.
Well, Bud, we got to wrap it up. On behalf of the American people, we want to thank you. We appreciate what the sacrifices that you and your compatriots made, and I really appreciate you giving us the opportunity to record this. And perhaps your great grandchildren can see you and from the
Well, I
Library of
hope so,
Congress.
because I'm very proud of my military record. To get the DSC and the Air Medal, you know, it's something to be proud of.
Sure.
And well, you know, it's all over, but we can't forget it.
No.
And we thank God we're alive.
Absolutely.
That's right. And you know, you wonder sometimes, why are you alive and somebody else isn't? Well, I'll say for you. There must be something we're still supposed to do. That's about all I can say. Well, thank you, Scotty. I enjoyed it, and I hope my ancestors do.
Well, thank you very much, Bud.
You bet.
Appreciate it.